This is the last lecture of a three-part lecture on how to write the rhetorical analysis essay. Last time we covered the introduction, and then in the latest video we cover the body paragraph. Now, today what I plan to do is cover the conclusion. So let's get started. When writing a conclusion paragraph, we want to follow the following recommendations. Number one, be brief, no more than 3 sentences, and really two is good enough. Get it over as quickly as possible. Think about it like this: you're writing an essay in 40 minutes. You have dedicated maybe 10 minutes to the reading and understanding of the text. Then you dedicated about 25 minutes to the writing of the intro and the bodies. Now you're in the last 5 minutes. Yeah, you can borrow some time from the other essays that you can write, but why do that? And perhaps what you should do is dedicate a good 5 minutes to writing a very concise conclusion and move on. As a general rule of thumb, the conclusion should not be larger than the introduction. And the introduction is already smaller than the body. Keep that in mind. So, another recommendation is don't summarize everything that you've already said. You've already said it. You don't need to summarize it. Think about it like this: you write an essay that is on average 2 pages, maybe 4 paragraphs, right? I, as an AP reader, when I read the college essays, the essays that the College Board reads, I read them in maybe a minute or a minute and a half. When I get to your conclusion, I don't need you to tell me everything you wrote. I read it, right? You didn't write a dissertation. It hasn't been 80 pages, and now you definitely do need to recap because it's been 80 pages. No, it's 2 pages. I can remember everything you said somewhat. So don't spend your time only summarizing everything you've said. I've already read it. Don't waste your time. Try not to use quotations, meaning don't start quoting things from the text. When you quote, the implication is that you're going to explain. If you begin explaining, well, that's a body paragraph. So try not to do that. Can I use a quote in the conclusion? Yeah, if there's something particularly interesting in language from the passage that you want to end with, maybe. Although I would not like to neither begin nor end with a quote. I don't like the idea of a writer using somebody else's words to begin or end their ideas. It's your essay, you start it, you end it. And the last recommendation is don't just restate your thesis, your strategy. So for instance, don't say the writer in this text uses blank and blank in order to accomplish blank. You already said that. Talk about the combined effect that these strategies have on the text. Talk about their more meaningful implications, what have you. Now, with this video, instead of going through the writing steps like I've done before, pair sentence 1, sentence 2, sentence 3, conclusions are very fluid. So I prefer instead to give you examples of 1 sentence conclusions and 2 sentence conclusions, and lastly a 3 sentence conclusion. Okay, 1 sentence conclusions. This is the one that we've been using, the same topic that we've been using throughout all the videos. Okay. By questioning American antagonism of intellectuals, Friedman seeks to change these long-standing views and implement superior ones in their place, arguing that by ostracizing the intellectually inclined and academically motivated, America is only ostracizing itself from a more tolerant and accepting world. This one gets an effective score. It's a very good conclusion. It's a 1 sentence conclusion. It wraps it all up, and it's got a nice flow to it, right? And it resonates on it's at the heart of the issue, right? America is ostracizing itself from a more tolerant and accepting world. That's very thematic. It's a nice little thing to end on. Look at this one, for instance. Still a 1 sentence conclusion, but it doesn't do as well as this one. Okay. Samuel Johnson reasonably denies this woman's request to give her son a letter of recommendation because he does not know him well enough to do so, and ends his letter with a sensible explanation along with a compliment to her child, leaving both parties feeling satisfied and guilt-free. This one, it works in the way in which it wraps everything up, but what I don't like about it is that there are too many ideas in one single sentence. Should have been broken up into two. Also, it feels very summative of everything, not really reflective of anything important. Now, let's look at 2 sentence conclusions. This one does really well, and this one does below what is expected. Now, keep in mind that the goal of these examples is to demonstrate that you can write good conclusions in 1 sentence to maybe even 3, although I'm not a fan of that one. But the idea is that you can still do well as long as you remember that there are certain key points, which we'll go over in a moment. Forlorn and forgotten are the men who truly rode the waves of their countries. In essence, this is what Bell's construction of migration in America amounts to. He is calculating yet respectful as he builds his argument and demonstrates that by becoming inhabitants rather than visitors, people can finally make a home for themselves and future generation. It's pretty. It's very thematic, right? Even if you haven't read the rest of the essay, you kind of have an idea of what he's talking about. He's talking about how migration works in America, right? And it seems like that argument, the argument that Bell has made, is that we need to become inhabitants of a place and not just visitors of a place, right? Now, I get all of that from reading this conclusion, and that's a good key to a conclusion. I understand what the text was about. If I'm able to read a conclusion and have an idea of what your essay was about, then you probably wrote a very good conclusion. But if I cannot feel excited about this language, about the thematic aspect of the conclusion, then you don't have that good of a conclusion, because you need to do both. Give me what it is that we have talked about, but also what it really means beyond what it is. So here's that same two sentences, but not as good. Bell constructs his perception of migration by effectively playing off Starr's beliefs and through the repetition of themes relating to movement. Very vague. Also, it seems to be discussing strategies that the body already discussed. He is calculating yet respectful as he builds his argument and demonstrates that by becoming inhabitants rather than visitors, people can finally make a home for themselves in future generations. It's got a lot of the same language from the previous one, right? Because they're essentially the same. All I did was strip away parts of it so that it would not sound as good, right? I, for instance, took this portion out. I made everything here I made it more stiff and more about summary. So that's what I mean. These are the examples that I'm trying to give you. Here's the last example, a 3-sentence conclusion. Have I ever seen a 3-sentence conclusion that does well? Yeah. Do many of them do? No. For the most part, 3-sentence conclusions fall apart. They're just too lengthy for a conclusion. In the end, all of these scenes can only be valuable if people stop to acknowledge and admire them. Louvre advocates the separation of man and nature by using descriptive language and an example of human interference to promote nature as being worthy of value and preservation. That's a really good sentence, but it doesn't belong in the conclusion. This is a sentence that gives me the main idea of things, maybe a thesis sentence. It belongs in the intro. It's a very good sentence for an intro. Although it is human nature to have as much control as possible, not everything in life needs to be controlled. And while this sounds pretty, this control that they're talking about here is not about how we can exert our control over things, right? It's about the power that nature has to control. We're not talking about human nature. The writer of this particular conclusion should have not conflated human nature and actual nature, because the two are not similar in this context. Okay, so here's an overview of the conclusion. Very simple stuff. Be brief, no more than 3, and 3's already pushing it. Don't just summarize everything you've said, all right? You want to reflect on your ideas, and I would like for your conclusion to be interesting, to be captivating, right? I want your conclusion to be something that is very attractive. This is the last thing that your reader will read before I score your essay. I read everything. When I get to the conclusion, I read it. And as soon as I'm done reading the conclusion, I put a score on that paper. Make it a really good conclusion. Sway me. Your conclusion is your opportunity to maybe go up a point. I was on the fence between this one and that one, and you know what? Your conclusion kind of tipped me over to the other side. So, use your conclusion wisely. Okay, that's it.